Welcome to our short talk on the process of negotiating formats for the practitioner thesis in our Doctorate of Professional Practice. I'm Samuel Mann, and this work is with Joe Kirkwood and Glenys Kerr. So we have a lot of people asking variations on the question, can my thesis be a novel? And that's the process we're talking about. We define our thesis, our end game, as being a practitioner thesis, which we don't define in a great amount of detail what it is, or an alternative negotiated format. And that process is what we're talking about. Just to give us some context, our doctorate is a third generation professional practice doctorate, although there is some discussion about whether or not we should be considering it a fourth generation, but that's a story for another day. The approach of Capable New Zealand is very much a heutagogical approach, very much putting the learners in control, self-determination, and so on. What does that mean within the constraints of a doctorate? Our approach is very much based on the articulation at the end of the new me, my articulation of my framework of practice, and starting with looking back, then looking forward with an aspirational framework of practice, developing from that the learning outcomes, the work-based project that aligns with that. So in the end, that is the claim of the doctorateness, that is the defensible argument. That claim needs to be supported by two major things: the work report, whether it be a creative work or a technical report, and the reflection on that, the meta-analysis, the critique, the reflection, or whatever it is. And there's lots of different ways of structuring that, from separate documents at this end to a more holistic approach at that end. And within the writing, there's lots of different ways of doing that. Right through to the more left field things, some poetry, a manuscript, a comic book, of how that might be structured. We do have a conventional approach to doing it that we offer to people, but for many people it comes down to these grunty questions. Can I write a novel as my thesis? We've worked together on this. It's inappropriate for this Indigenous knowledge to be captured in this format. I want to do it entirely as an interactive documentary, and so on and so on. So we need to actually have a process by which that negotiated format is negotiated. The theory supports us on this: the principal agent of control, the candidates justifying against the criteria, and we need to align that with the institutional expectations about assessment. So we have then the two things. We have the need to articulate the professional framework of practice, then make the claim of doctorateness, tell the story of how we've got there, and do so at a way that is level 10. Now, we started by going through a process of writing down all the different things that people were allowed to do, would be allowed to do, in terms of looking at them, in terms of where the project sat and where the exegesis sits. And we talked to a lot of people who had done variations on alternative thesis. And what we realized that it wasn't so much about the format itself, but by the process by which that was allowed. And the people that we talked to reported fighting the institution for years, trying to demonstrate that they did in fact meet the criteria. That wasn't, is it written down and in this particular format? So here's our process. People do in fact describe what they're intending doing during the learning agreement, and they answer the question of how will this format carry the intricacies of my practice and my professional framework of practice? Does it hold collective ways of knowing? Does it hold the voice of the child? Does it respect oral tradition? Whatever the particular elements of that are. We're not making the decision based on that. That what matters to the institution is how will this format allow my claim of doctorateness and the scrutiny of that claim. So this is putting up front them saying, this is what I think my claim of doctorateness is going to be, and this is how that format will support that claim of doctorateness and allow it to be assessed. So we worked through a series of straw men arguments. Can I write my novel as a thesis? Clearly, you can write a thesis about someone else's novel. You could write a thesis about your own novel. That same material, the about part, the exegesis part, if you will, could be in chapter notes or in sidebars. That same material could be integrated into the text itself. It could be fully integrated into the text itself, so that you could just read it as a great story, or you could read it as a commentary on practice. Of course, that would mean we'd need to find assessors that could read both. In terms of our negotiation process, we have the format that's described, we have the why they want to do it that way, and then crucially, the description of the document. A second strawman case to test this approach is that of partnership assessment. So Peter has worked to be a kaitiaki in fisheries management. This is a mix of cultural knowledge and technical knowledge for which, for the sake of argument, we can't find assessors to consider both sides of. And so we propose a partnership assessment where the community and the assessors come together to discuss what doctorateness means, what kaitiaki means, and whether or not those two things come together to be allowed the recommendation of the pass for the doctorate. In terms of the assessment process, in terms of the negotiation process, it works in terms of the description of what you're trying to do, the why you want to do it, and the process of considering why that. So this process, what we're now referring to as the modalities of assessment, has been piloted, has been discussed by our academic board, and is being incorporated into our learning agreement process. We look forward to discussing this with you. Please feel free to contact me through these channels. Thank you for listening.